Allegory is the lowest form of art. We are in the midst of what is essentially an inverse renaissance of media. The quality of writing and storytelling in film and television is at an all-time low, and there are many reasons for this, some of which might be demographic. The people who were writing good TV and movies back in the day just aren't doing it anymore. But that question aside, the main reason that modern media sucks appears to be the fact that it's all explicitly allegorical. Movies like the Star Wars sequel trilogy, the latest Star Trek show, and even Blade Runner 2049 to some extent are artistically shallow and serve only to deliver leftist propaganda. In the sequel trilogy, this is quite apparent, as stated that the First Order is a quote-unquote white supremacist organization, and in the film, the Resistance is, in contrast, a rainbow coalition of various ethnicities, which is evident in the casting. The protagonist is female, and there is an obvious feminist agenda in these films. For example, Kathleen Kennedy and others pushed a hashtag called "The Force is Female." Many critics and reviewers gushed at how strong and powerful Rey was in the films, and it's quite clear that the goal was to present women not just as equals to men, but as superiors to men. Rey is an obvious demographic insert character for the female audience, because she's so powerful and so narratively unjustified in anything she does that she has practically nothing approaching a struggle or character flaw. On screen, she's beating up men like it's no big deal, she's instantly good at anything she does, and she requires no training. She's outright granted superpowers because she's a conduit of the Force or something like that without ever having earned that status. The goal was to overshadow the male hero Luke Skywalker, as is evident in The Last Jedi, where Luke, now an old, forgotten, and bygone man, retreats to an island to die. A recurrent theme in the film is that the old must die to give way to the new, and the implication is that male heroism must die so it can be replaced by female heroism. The whole series is an allegory for the leftist political cause, which is a big reason why it just doesn't feel like the classic films, which had no such allegorical bent. The writers are now stumbling over themselves to promote leftist messages. If they weren't shackled by feminism, they could have given Rey some actual character. She would have had to show some real human vulnerability and some actual flaws like a real human being has. But the feminist agenda requires that Rey never suffers at the hands of men, nor ever requires their aid. She has to be a Mary Sue, and there's just no other way. Star Trek was released in 2016 at the height of Trump hysteria. The writers were quick to remind people on Twitter that the Klingons were white conservative Trump-supporting fascists, and the subtext is that the warlike nature of conservatism is self-destructive. The allegory in Blade Runner 2049 is somewhat more subtle, but it's essentially an abolitionism and anti-racism allegory. The main character is cast out from society because he's an android and forced out into the wastes, where he meets Deckard, who may or may not be an android who represents the past. There's some conflict, and then he is rescued by a group of android rebels who are working to emancipate and rescue other androids. The main character is, of course, an android. The themes of otherization, enslavement, and liberation are quite obvious, so obvious that the latter half of the film is laughable and even forgettable. Perhaps the most obvious example of allegory taking over screenwriting is Jordan Peele's Get Out, which is an allegory for the exploitation of black bodies and black labor. In the film, a black man named Chris Washington travels to New York to meet his white girlfriend, Rose's family. However, the getaway is actually a plot to kidnap and hypnotize Chris so Jim Hudson, a blind white man, can steal his body for its eyesight. It turns out that the family is transplanting brains into black people's bodies to gain a form of immortality, mirroring the leftist belief that white civilization was founded on black labor or black bodies, the body being the site of autonomy. The movie itself is poorly written and awkward, full of implicit racial tension and an uncomfortable degree of obvious bleep commentary. It is probably the greatest proof that allegory is the lowest form of art. This allegorical menace has so saturated film that it has begun to bleed into the people who watch it. A YouTuber named Zane, who runs a horror channel called In Praise of Shadows, released a poorly received video analysis of The Hills Have Eyes, in which he casts the innocent family that gets lost in the woods looking for their dog as white colonial invaders, and the twisted evil cannibal people as oppressed and marginalized people. What a good look to give oppressed and marginalized people. He more or less states a common leftist canard that all art is political, and even further states that horror is inherently a leftist and punk genre.
Horror is an intrinsically left, punk, anti-establishment, countercultural art form that is primarily concerned with social issues and pushing boundaries beyond what is deemed acceptable by traditional, more conservative, polite society. There's no other way that you can rationally look at it and still exist within reality. Folks constantly talk about the political undertones in my videos, but horror is an unabashedly political genre that is concerned directly with issues facing the current society. And if you're in the horror space and you don't regularly acknowledge this foundation as a challenge to power, then I just assume you're in it for the money, or that you don't actually care, or you're just really bad at your job. And if
in the first place, art can be about way more than just politics. To claim that all art is political is to deny the full range of human expression, and even to outright deny the importance of pathos. What allegories truly lack is this pathos. Character drama, tragedy, people struggling with their flaws. Instead, the story becomes a struggle over society. Everything is externalized, and the pathos, now having no object, ceases to exist. That's the big reason why modern movies and TV feel so soulless. It's because people like Zane, who insist on externalizing everything into the political, have taken it over. Ray is just a representative of feminism. She isn't a character. Chris is just a stand-in for black people. He's not a real character. What effectively happens when you externalize conflicts is you create a black hole of personality where a person should be, with all his flaws and wants and fears, and instead you've got nothing but an intellectual dichotomy that appears on screen. Oppressor and oppressed, patriarchy and female empowerment. And this negatively affects the plot as well, because it's never acceptable to show the favored ideology failing. It's never acceptable to portray it as flawed. These movies end up as power fantasies, sort of like the conservative favorite World War II movies and shows, where the good guys win and the bad guys lose. No attempt at introspection nor mature exploration of the themes is attempted, and no attempt is ever given to humanize or really look into and give us a deep dive into the psychology of the other side. What's also absurd about Zane's statement is that horror as a genre far precedes the political existence of leftism. He thinks that the purpose of horror is to push boundaries and to critique the bourgeoisie, but the truth is actually much more parsimonious. The purpose of horror is to scare people. Its pathos is its purpose. The subject matter of horror is typically ancient, and the actual origin of these scary stories itself is ancient. There are myriad myths and legends about witches, demons, spirits, demonic possession, and so on that stretch back before 1000 AD. It should be absurd to declare that horror at this stage ever had a political purpose. Even modern horror fiction is inspired by classical works. For example, Frankenstein was inspired by the story of Hippolytus. Even around 113 AD, there were stories of haunted houses. Athenodorus Cananides is said to have bought a haunted house, according to Pliny the Younger. In the Middle Ages, there were stories about witches and werewolves, such as Marie de Francais' 12 Lies. Then in the 18th century, there was Gothic horror. And in the 19th century, classics such as the Brothers Grimm's Hansel and Gretel. Most of these stories were based on folklore and local legends, usually an embellishment of them, or even possibly the experiences of real people who may have encountered the supernatural. It would be a stretch to say that horror writers were pushing the social envelope because they were already basing their stories on currents that existed in society, like, as I've said, you might find in folklore. To ascribe a political purpose to these stories is preposterous, and the literary tradition of using horror just to scare people continues to this day. The entire reason people tell scary stories is to scare people. Schizoid leftists like Zane are seeing allegories where they do not exist because they've convinced themselves to externalize everything to politics. They become deeply mentally ill, incapable of appreciating the full depth of life. When the allegorical menace takes over even the audience, we can be sure that art is very close to hitting the gutter. Real artistic genius doesn't simply reflect the zeitgeist, but rather it reflects something central to the human condition, as well as the special personality of that artist. The more one externalizes, the less genius can be responsible for works. All good art comes from within, and until artists once again learn that lesson, we are doomed to more garbage movies and television. Now let's move on to another question, which is the divide between conservatives and leftists on media.
And that I think there's actually not one, but two distinct horror communities that do not overlap. one that is more concerned with writing and thinking about how our own experiences and world are reflected through art. A group that overall is less concerned with how much a movie makes at the box office and more with what it is trying to say as a work of art, and how it relates to ourselves and culture as people. And then you have another that is more conservative and traditionally capital A American, and is based more in basic consumerism, and viewing movies strictly as entertainment and nothing else. A group that often gets angry at the very notion of subtext existing within a work of fiction, and views art not as a means to express what it means to exist, but instead that sees the value of creation just within the context of how fun and experience that product is.
Zane declares that conservatives are just consumers who want cheap entertainment that doesn't call upon them to think, but honestly, not all media is or has to be that deep. Most horror stories don't even have much subtext. There might be a warning about the occult or warnings against sinfulness somewhere in ancient and medieval horror, but there's no overarching political or metatextual point beyond that. The purpose is primarily to scare the reader and to imaginatively reinterpret folklore in an entertaining way. But aside from that, it's not as if conservatives don't like subtext. The problem is that leftists are shoehorning in their own Marxist subtext into films that never even had any Marxist intentions, and this is pissing off conservatives who just think the horror films are, well, horror films. What's the metatextual meaning of the Saw films? Well, there kind of isn't one unless you really stretch. They're just cheap gore movies intended to shock the audience for entertainment value. A lot of horror is like that, and we're naturally drawn to that which is shocking to us. Maybe something can be said about the brutality depicted in the films offending societal sensibilities, but that's about it. There's no anti-capitalist message, just a kind of juvenile irreverence put on display. When you have causey people looking for messages and literally everything they have, they're just trying to put the cult upon you. They don't actually care about the media. Leftists should seriously question the absolute need for political subtext in media. It doesn't always exist, and if you go searching for it in unlikely pieces of media, you're going to seriously miss the point of the story. Not every work of art is 1984 or Animal Farm. Authorial intent is wide and diverse, and often films are simply what they are, just an aesthetic treatment of a subject matter. Was Dunkirk an anti-war film? I don't think so. It was brutal and horrifying, just as war is, but there's not really any metatext. It's just an unapologetic and gritty depiction of the First World War. Zane, like a lot of leftists, is the kind of guy who will see a utility mark on the sidewalk and think it's a swastika and that, therefore, the utility company is secretly right-wing. He's like a schizoid, constantly looking for hidden meanings, assembling disparate and unrelated facts into an amalgam, and then declaring that once he has his little string board up on the wall, he's figured it all out. If the problem is that conservatives hate metatextual meaning, maybe he should read Countercurrents, because there are right-wingers who have done numerous kinds of analysis on films and books. Conservatives actually really like to give a reactionary reading of Lord of the Rings, for example, so it's not a problem with rightists disliking metatext. What's going on is that leftists are waging an ideological war through media and browbeating anyone who doesn't agree with them. They have taken over media, they have taken over the power institutions, and are shifting culture into a leftist direction. They will do anything to shift the blame for the horrible consequences this has had on art over to conservatives who are just too dumb to understand their allegorical genius. But this isn't the fault of conservatives. Allegories just suck, and doubly so if they're leftist schizoid theories.